40 enormous circular depressions sit on the floor of Lake Michigan, some of them wider than a football field, arranged in patterns that look almost deliberate. Nobody put them there on purpose, at least nobody we know of. And that is only the beginning, because the same lake also hides a forest that has been standing underwater for 8,000 years, a mile-long line of stones that the internet insists is an American Stonehenge, a 17th century ship that has been found at least half a dozen times, yet remains officially missing. A passenger airliner that vanished with 58 people on board and has never been located despite 2 decades of searching. A fragment pulled from the lakebed that might have fallen from space, and a schooner still carrying a cargo of Christmas trees more than a century after it sank. Lake Michigan is the third largest of the Great Lakes by surface area, stretching roughly 500 kilometers from north to south, with a maximum depth of about 280 meters. To most people, it is a vacation destination, a shipping corridor, a source of drinking water for millions. But beneath its surface lies a record of geological violence, dramatic climate shifts, human ambition, human failure, and genuinely unresolved scientific questions that most visitors never hear about. Today we are crossing this lake from one end to the other, and at each stop the water gets stranger. The story begins not at the shoreline, but more than 100 meters below it, in a part of the lake where sunlight never reaches, and where the pressure alone would crush most expectations about what a freshwater lake is supposed to look like. In the early 2000s, researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began conducting high-resolution multi-beam sonar surveys of the Lake Michigan lakebed. The purpose was partly navigational, partly geological, and partly driven by the simple fact that enormous sections of the bottom of the Great Lakes had never been mapped in any meaningful detail. For most of the 20th century, depth charts of the lakes relied on relatively sparse soundings. What modern sonar revealed was a landscape far more complex than anyone had assumed. Among the most striking features were roughly 40 large, nearly circular depressions found at depths of approximately 140 meters in certain parts of the lake. Some of these depressions measured between 90 and 180 meters across. Several were arranged in what appeared to be a chain-like formation, spaced at intervals that looked almost regular. When the sonar images first circulated, the immediate reaction from parts of the internet was predictable. Impact craters, evidence of bombardment, possibly even artificial structures. The reality, as usual, turned out to be more complicated and in many ways more interesting than the speculation. The bedrock beneath this part of Lake Michigan includes layers of Silurian-age limestone and dolomite, formations that are hundreds of millions of years old and known to be susceptible to dissolution by groundwater. One of the leading explanations for the depressions involves exactly this process. Over long periods, slightly acidic groundwater moving through fractures in the rock can dissolve carbide minerals, creating voids that eventually collapse. The result is a sinkhole, and sinkholes in limestone terrain are common across the world. What makes these particular features unusual is their size, their depth beneath the lake surface, and their apparent alignment. Another hypothesis involves groundwater discharge. In some geological settings, pressurized groundwater can emerge through the lakebed, and over time, the flow can erode sediment and underlying rock, producing circular depressions. Researchers have identified active groundwater seeps in other parts of the Great Lakes, so the mechanism is not speculative. Whether it can account for depressions this large and this regular is a different question. A third possibility ties the features to glacial processes. The Great Lakes themselves were carved by massive ice sheets during the Pleistocene. When the glaciers retreated, they left behind an extraordinary variety of landforms, some of which are still being cataloged. Subglacial meltwater channels, kettle holes formed by buried blocks of ice, and depressions created by differential loading of the crust are all documented phenomena. Any of these could, in principle, have contributed to the features visible on the sonar maps. What makes the mystery genuinely difficult is that testing these explanations requires more than sonar. It requires direct sampling of the lakebed sediment inside and around the depressions, analysis of the underlying rock structure, measurement of any active groundwater flow, and ideally, submersible or remotely operated vehicle surveys that can image the features at close range. At depths of 140 meters, none of this is trivial. The Great Lakes are not the ocean, but they are deep enough, cold enough, and dark enough to make underwater fieldwork expensive and logistically demanding. As of the most recent published research, no single explanation has been confirmed to the exclusion of the others. The depressions are real, they are large, their pattern is unusual, and the lake, as it so often does, is keeping the answer to itself for now. But the lake bed has more to reveal than geology, because roughly 100 meters above those mysterious depressions, in the shallower waters of southern Lake Michigan, something even more unexpected is standing in the dark. About 25 kilometers offshore from Chicago, at a depth of roughly 24 to 26 meters, researchers discovered a cluster of tree stumps. Not driftwood, not logs that had rolled off a barge or washed out from a river mouth. These were stumps still rooted in the substrate, still standing upright in their original growth positions, preserved in the cold, low-oxygen water of the lake bottom. There were at least 50 of them. Radiocarbon dating of the oak and ash wood produced ages of more than 8,000 years, placing the forest firmly in the early Holocene, during a period when the Great Lakes were undergoing some of the most dramatic hydrological changes in their history. To understand why a forest is standing at the bottom of Lake Michigan, you have to understand what happened to the lakes after the last ice age. The Laurentide ice sheet, which at its maximum covered most of Canada and large parts of the northern United States under ice up to 3 kilometers thick, began retreating roughly 18,000 years ago. As the ice melted, the Great Lakes went through a complex series of stages. Water levels rose and fell dramatically, sometimes by tens of meters, as meltwater was rerouted through different outlets, as the crust slowly rebounded from the weight of the ice, and as the climate itself shifted. During certain low water stages, areas that are now deep beneath the lake's surface were dry land. Not barren, glacially scoured rock, but actual terrestrial landscapes with soil, vegetation, and, as the evidence now shows, mature forests. The trees that grew 25 kilometers from where Chicago now stands were alive during one of these low water intervals. They grew, matured, and at some point, the water returned. Lake levels rose, the forest was submerged, and the cold freshwater environment preserved the stumps in place for roughly 80 centuries. What makes this discovery more than a geological curiosity is what it implies about the landscape that early human populations in the region would have known. 8,000 years ago, people were living in the Great Lakes region. The Archaic period cultures that inhabited the area were hunters, fishers, and gatherers who would have used exactly the kind of terrain that this forest represents. Dry, forested land extending far out into what is now open water would have offered resources, shelter, and travel routes that simply do not exist today. We cannot say with certainty that people walked through this particular forest. No human artifacts have been recovered from the site. But the environmental reconstruction is clear. The geography of this region 8,000 years ago was radically different from what anyone standing on the Chicago waterfront today would recognize. Entire landscapes that early peoples may have relied on are now buried beneath the lake. What do you think that shoreline looked like when these trees were still alive? A forest stretching into the distance where today there is nothing but open water and shipping lanes. Was it a hunting ground? A seasonal camp? A corridor between communities we know almost nothing about? Write your answer in the comments, because this is one of those rare cases where the physical evidence is right there, standing on the bottom of the lake, but the human story that goes with it may be gone forever. The idea that people once lived and worked on land now submerged beneath the Great Lakes is not speculation. It is one of the most active areas of research in North American underwater archaeology. And the next stop on this journey takes us to a place where that research collides with one of the most persistent myths on the internet. Grand Traverse Bay sits in the northwestern part of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. It is a long, narrow body of water that opens into Lake Michigan, with depths reaching about 50 meters in places. The bay is popular with tourists, sailors, and fishermen. It is not the kind of place most people associate with archaeological controversy, but in 2007, it became exactly that. Mark Hawley, an underwater archaeologist working at Northwestern Michigan College, was conducting sonar surveys of the bay floor when his equipment picked up an unusual feature. Beneath the water lay a line of stones extending for more than a mile. The stones appeared to be arranged in a roughly linear formation, and some of them were large enough to be clearly distinguishable from the surrounding lakebed sediment. What happened next is a case study in how the internet turns a genuine discovery into something it was never meant to be. Within months, the find was being described online as the Lake Michigan Stonehenge. Articles and videos claimed that a megalithic stone circle had been discovered beneath the bay, sometimes complete with dramatic illustrations of standing stones arranged in precise astronomical alignments. The story spread rapidly, picked up by websites and YouTube channels that specialize in ancient mysteries, and before long it had become one of the most widely repeated archaeological claims about the Great Lakes. There was one problem. Mark Hawley himself repeatedly stated that the description was wrong. There is no Stonehenge-like circle at the bottom of Grand Traverse Bay. What exists is a long, linear arrangement of stones, and while it is genuinely interesting, it bears almost no resemblance to the megalithic monument on Salisbury Plain. Hawley was careful in his public statements. He acknowledged that the stone alignment was unusual, and that some of the stones might have been placed or arranged by humans at a time when the bay floor was dry land. He also noted that one stone appeared to bear a carving that could depict a mastodon, an animal that went extinct in the Great Lakes region roughly 10,000 years ago. But he was equally clear that much more research would be needed before any firm conclusions could be drawn, and that the Stonehenge label was misleading and unhelpful. The reason the human arrangement hypothesis is even plausible has to do with what we already know about prehistoric activity on now submerged Great Lakes landscapes. In Lake Huron, underwater archaeologists led by John O'Shea of the University of Michigan have documented stone features on the Alpena Amberley Ridge, a land bridge that connected parts of what is now Michigan and Ontario when lake levels were lower. These features include V-shaped stone lines and small stone blinds that closely resemble caribou hunting structures known from the Arctic. The structures date to roughly 9,000 years ago, and their identification as human-made hunting features is supported by their morphology, their positions in the landscape, and comparisons with ethnographically documented hunting techniques. The question is whether the Grand Traverse Bay stones represent something similar. It is possible. The bay floor was dry land during low water stages of the ancestral Great Lakes, and prehistoric peoples were certainly present in the region during those periods. But possibility is not proof. To confirm that the stones were deliberately placed by humans, researchers would need to demonstrate that their arrangement cannot be explained by natural processes, such as glacial deposition, ice rafting, or sediment transport. They would also need to recover associated artifacts, datable organic material, or other evidence of human activity from the site. As of the most recent publicly available information, that level of evidence has not been produced. The stones are real, their arrangement is unusual, the mastodon carving, if confirmed, would be extraordinary. But the site remains in a frustrating middle ground, too interesting to dismiss, too poorly documented to confirm. And if the story of the Grand Traverse Bay stones is a reminder that not every underwater mystery lives up to its internet reputation, the next story is a reminder that some mysteries are even deeper than they first appear, and far older. If mysteries like this fascinate you, subscribe to the channel, because the deeper we look beneath the surface of the Great Lakes, the more often the simple version of history turns out to be incomplete. In the late summer of 1679, a small wooden sailing vessel cleared the mouth of Green Bay and headed out into Lake Michigan. The ship was called Le Griffon, and it was the first full-sized European sailing ship known to have navigated the upper Great Lakes. Its builder and commander was René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, one of the most ambitious and ultimately tragic figures of French exploration in North America. Le Griffon was not large by ocean-going standards. Estimates of its size vary, but most historians describe it as a bark of roughly 40 to 45 tons, perhaps 15 to 20 meters in length. La Salle had ordered its construction near the Niagara River, and after its launch it sailed across Lake Erie, through the Detroit River, across Lake Huron, and into Lake Michigan, becoming the first European vessel to make the journey. At Green Bay, La Salle loaded the ship with a cargo of furs, reportedly worth a substantial sum, and ordered a small crew to sail Le Griffon back eastward, while he continued his own journey south by canoe. The ship departed on September 18, 1679. It was never seen again. What happened to Le Griffon has been debated for more than 300 years. Contemporary accounts suggest that a storm struck the upper lake shortly after the ship's departure. Some early sources hint at the possibility that the crew turned against La Salle's orders, perhaps attempting to steal the cargo. Others suggest the ship was simply overwhelmed by weather in waters its crew did not know. The problem with identifying the wreck is not a lack of candidates. It is an excess of them. Over the centuries, at least half a dozen discoveries have been announced as the true remains of Le Griffon. Wrecks, timbers, and submerged structures found in various parts of Lake Michigan and Lake Huron have all been proposed at one time or another. In 2001, a team led by wreck hunter Steve Libert identified a wooden structure in the waters of Lake Michigan near Poverty Island that he believed to be the remains of Le Griffon. The claim generated significant media attention, and Libert spent years pursuing permits and funding to investigate further. Subsequent examination of the site, however, did not produce conclusive evidence. The state of Michigan's archaeologists and other researchers raised significant doubts about the identification. In 2014 and 2015, another claim surfaced involving a wreck found near the western end of Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. French-Canadian diver Fabien Cousteau, the grandson of the famous ocean explorer, was among those who visited the site. But once again, the evidence fell short of definitive identification. Determining whether a specific pile of deteriorated wood on a lakebed is a 17th century French bark, as opposed to any number of other vessels that have sunk in the Great Lakes over the past 4 centuries, requires more than shape and location. It requires datable timbers, identifiable construction techniques, artifacts consistent with the period and origin, and ideally some feature unique to the vessel itself. The Great Lakes have claimed thousands of ships. Many of those wrecks are wooden, many are old, and many are unidentified. Picking Le Griffon out of that underwater graveyard, especially when the ship's exact route after leaving Green Bay is unknown, is a problem that may never be fully solved. What makes Le Griffon more than a treasure-hunting curiosity is what it represents in the broader history of European exploration of North America. It was the first ship of its kind on these waters. Its loss marked the beginning of La Salle's long descent into financial ruin, failed expeditions, and eventual assassination by his own men in Texas in 1687. The ship is a symbol, both of the ambition that drove European expansion into the interior of the continent and of how utterly that ambition could be swallowed by the landscape. The true resting place of Le Griffon is still unknown, and given the conditions at the bottom of the Great Lakes, where cold, fresh water can preserve wood for centuries, but also bury it under layers of silt and zebra mussels, it is entirely possible that the wreck is intact somewhere beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the right equipment and the right coordinates to find it. But if a 17th century sailing ship can vanish so completely in these waters, consider what happened to something far larger and far more recent in the same lake in full view of the 20th century. On the evening of June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 took off from New York City bound for Minneapolis. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, a 4-engine propeller-driven airliner that had been the workhorse of both military and commercial aviation in the 1940s. On board were 55 passengers and 3 crew members, 58 people in total. The DC-4 was not a small airplane. It had a wingspan of nearly 36 meters and a maximum takeoff weight of more than 33,000 kilograms. It was a robust, well-proven design. The pilot, Captain Robert Lind, was an experienced aviator with thousands of hours of flight time. As Flight 2501 crossed over the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, conditions deteriorated. A squall line of severe thunderstorms was moving across the lake. Captain Lind radioed requesting permission to descend from his cruising altitude of around 11,000 feet to 2,500 feet, apparently hoping to fly beneath the worst of the weather. The request was denied by air traffic control due to other traffic in the area. That was the last communication from the aircraft. Sometime during the early hours of June 24th, Flight 2501 went down over Lake Michigan. No distress call was received, no survivors were found. Within hours, debris began washing ashore along the eastern coast of the lake near South Haven, Michigan. Searchers recovered fragments of the aircraft, personal belongings, mail from the cargo hold, and human remains. The condition of the recovered material indicated that the aircraft had broken apart, either in the air or upon impact with the water, with tremendous force. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated. Their report, released in 1951, concluded that the probable cause of the accident could not be determined. The board noted the severe weather conditions and suggested that the aircraft may have encountered extreme turbulence, a downdraft, or structural failure, but the absence of the main wreckage made a definitive finding impossible. And the main wreckage was never found. This is the detail that turns a tragic airline disaster into an enduring mystery. The DC-4 was a large, heavy aircraft with 4 engines, landing gear, and a metal airframe. When a plane of that size crashes into a body of water, there should be wreckage on the bottom. Flight 2501 went down in a lake, not an ocean. Lake Michigan's maximum depth is roughly 280 meters, and the area where the crash is believed to have occurred is significantly shallower. The wreckage should, by any reasonable expectation, be findable. Beginning in 2004, a group called the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association, led by Valerie Van Heest and others, launched a systematic search for the crash site. Using side-scan sonar, the team surveyed approximately 700 square miles of lakebed in the area where debris was recovered. The effort continued, off and on, for roughly 2 decades. They found things. The Great Lakes are full of objects on their floors, but they did not find the main wreckage of Flight 2501. In early 2025, the organized search was ended without the aircraft having been located. How does a 4-engine airliner disappear in a lake? Several factors work against searchers. The lakebed in the area is not bare rock. It is covered in soft sediment, mud, and sand that can shift over time, potentially burying objects that settled into it decades ago. Currents within the lake, while not as powerful as ocean currents, can redistribute sediment and move lighter debris. The crash itself, if the aircraft struck the water at high speed and broke apart, may have scattered wreckage over a very wide area, with individual pieces too small or too deeply buried to produce a clear sonar signature. There is also the problem of search area. The last known position of the aircraft was approximate, based on radio communications and radar coverage that, in 1950, was far less precise than modern systems. A difference of even a few miles in the estimated crash location translates into hundreds of additional square miles of lakebed to survey. 58 people went into Lake Michigan that night. Their families never received the closure that recovering the aircraft might have provided. The lake, which had already held Le Griffon for centuries and would go on to hold other secrets for decades more, simply absorbed Flight 2501 and kept it. And sometimes the lake gives back something that nobody expected to find. Not a ship or a plane, but something that fell from considerably higher up. If you have watched this far, do something for us. Share this video with someone who has never thought about what might be sitting on the bottom of the Great Lakes. Because every mystery in this video is real, documented, and still waiting for a better answer. On the evening of February 6, 2017, a fireball streaked across the sky above Lake Michigan. Hundreds of witnesses reported seeing it. Dashcam and security cameras captured the event. The American Meteor Society received more than 500 reports from observers across several Midwestern states. The object was bright, fast, and broke apart as it descended, producing multiple fragments. Trajectory analysis, based on the visual reports and camera footage, suggested that surviving fragments of the meteoroid had likely fallen into Lake Michigan, roughly 10 miles off the shoreline of Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. This is the point where most meteor stories end. Something falls from space, it lands in a body of water, and it is gone. Searching the bottom of a lake for fragments of rock that might be only a few centimeters across is, under normal circumstances, an absurd undertaking. But a group of scientists decided to try. The effort was organized by Adler Planetarium in Chicago, with involvement from specialists connected to NASA, the Field Museum of Natural History, and the Shedd Aquarium. The team faced an immediate problem. Lake Michigan's floor in the target area is covered in fine sediment. A meteorite fragment landing in that sediment would sink into it, and even if it remained near the surface, finding a small rock among the mud and debris of a lake bottom that has been accumulating material for thousands of years requires something more than a diver with a flashlight. The team developed a specialized collection device, essentially a magnetic sled designed to be dragged across the lakebed, picking up any ferromagnetic material it passed over. The approach was based on the fact that most stony meteorites contain metallic iron-nickel grains, making them susceptible to magnetic attraction. The sled was deployed from a boat, dragged along transects calculated to cover the most probable impact zone, and the collected material was brought back to the surface for analysis. Among the particles recovered was one that immediately caught the attention of the researchers. Laboratory analysis revealed that this tiny fragment contained unusually high concentrations of nickel. This matters because nickel content is one of the primary diagnostic criteria used to distinguish meteoritic material from terrestrial rock. Most rocks on Earth's surface contain relatively low concentrations of nickel. Meteorites, particularly those from the most common class, known as ordinary chondrites, typically contain nickel in concentrations significantly higher than terrestrial background levels. The nickel is bound in iron-nickel alloy grains that formed in the solar nebula more than 4.5 billion years ago, long before Earth itself existed. The researchers described the nickel-rich particle as a very promising candidate for a meteorite fragment. They were careful, however, not to declare it a confirmed find. Full confirmation of extraterrestrial origin typically requires additional analysis, including determination of the mineral phases present, measurement of isotopic ratios, and comparison with known meteorite compositions. Industrial contamination, certain types of slag, and specific terrestrial minerals can also produce elevated nickel readings, so rigorous verification is essential. Whether the fragment is ultimately confirmed as meteoritic or not, the search itself was remarkable. It was one of the very few organized scientific attempts to recover freshly fallen meteorite material from the bottom of a major body of water. The fact that it produced a plausible candidate from the lakebed of Lake Michigan, using equipment designed specifically for the task, demonstrated that the lake's ability to hide things is not always absolute. Sometimes, with enough ingenuity and enough patience, the lake gives something back. And sometimes what it gives back is something profoundly human, preserved so perfectly that it feels less like archaeology and more like opening a door that was never meant to be opened again. On the morning of November 22, 1912, the three-masted schooner Rouse Simmons cleared the harbor of Thompson, Michigan, near the northern end of Lake Michigan. Her holds were packed with freshly cut Christmas trees, thousands of them, destined for the Clark Street docks in Chicago. The ship had made the run before. Captain Herman Schooneman, known locally as Captain Santa, had turned the annual delivery of Christmas trees from the upper Michigan forests to the Chicago market into a personal tradition. Each December, he would sell trees directly from the deck of his ship at the wharf, and the arrival of the Christmas tree ship had become a minor event in the city. The Rouse Simmons was old. Built in 1868, she was already 44 years in service and had seen better days. The 1912 voyage was late in the season, the weather was deteriorating, and the crew was small. Witnesses along the Wisconsin shore reported seeing the schooner struggling in heavy seas, her rigging damaged, a distress flag flying from her mast. The life-saving station at Kewanee, Wisconsin, launched a boat, but the seas were too rough, and the Rouse Simmons was too far offshore to reach. The ship disappeared. For weeks afterward, Christmas trees washed ashore along the western coast of Lake Michigan. Personal effects, fragments of the hull, and pieces of cargo were recovered. But the Rouse Simmons herself, along with Captain Schooneman and all hands, was gone. The wreck remained missing for 59 years. In 1971, a diver named Gordon Kent Bell Richard located the remains of the Rouse Simmons at a depth of roughly 50 meters, approximately 12 miles off the town of Two Rivers, Wisconsin. The discovery was confirmed by subsequent dives and eventually by underwater archaeological investigation. What the divers found inside the wreck was extraordinary. Stacks of Christmas trees were still in the holds, preserved by the cold, dark water of the lake. The trees had not decayed in the usual sense. Lake Michigan at 50 meters is cold, on the order of 4 degrees Celsius year-round, and at that depth there is no light, minimal current, and very low levels of biological activity compared to warmer surface waters. Organic material placed in these conditions can survive far longer than it would on land or in shallower water. Some of the trees found deeper in the holds, partially buried in the sediment that had slowly accumulated inside the wreck, reportedly still had their needles attached. It is an image that is difficult to shake. Christmas trees, cut more than a century ago, packed into a wooden ship that sank in a winter storm, still carrying their needles on the bottom of a great lake, decades after anyone who might have decorated them had passed away. The wreck itself offered clues about the final moments of the Rouse Simmons. The anchor was deployed, suggesting that the crew made an attempt to stop the ship or hold position as conditions worsened. The anchor chain was fully extended. The hull showed damage consistent with the heavy seas reported by witnesses, and the mast was broken. The overall picture is one of a crew fighting to save an aging vessel in conditions that were beyond its capacity to survive. There is something particularly haunting about the Rouse Simmons that separates it from the hundreds of other shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. It is not the age, or the depth, or the manner of sinking. It is the cargo. Christmas trees are one of the most emotionally specific objects in Western culture. They are associated with homes, with families, with a particular season, and a particular feeling. Finding them stacked in the dark belly of a shipwreck, at the bottom of a freezing lake, more than 100 years after they were cut, creates a dissonance that no other cargo could produce. The ship that was supposed to bring Christmas to Chicago instead became a permanent underwater memorial to everyone who sailed on her. The Rouse Simmons was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Dive expeditions continue to visit the site, although the wreck is deteriorating, as all wooden structures eventually do, even in the preserving cold of the deep lake. The trees are still there, the needles are still there. Time has not entirely stopped at the bottom of Lake Michigan, but it has slowed down enough to hold on to things that the surface world lost more than a century ago. And this is perhaps the most unsettling thing about Lake Michigan, the thread that connects every mystery in this video. The lake does not just hide things, it preserves them. 40 enormous depressions stamped into the lake bed by forces we have not yet fully identified. A forest of 8,000-year-old trees still standing where they grew, in a landscape that has not been dry land since before the pyramids were built. A mile-long stone alignment that might be evidence of prehistoric hunters, or might be a trick of glacial geology. A 17th century ship that launched the age of European navigation on the upper Great Lakes and then vanished so completely that 3 centuries of searching have not produced a confirmed fragment. A 4-engine airliner that went down with 58 souls aboard and has eluded every modern search technology thrown at it for more than 75 years. A particle of nickel-rich material pulled from the mud that might have formed in the solar nebula 4.5 billion years ago. And a schooner full of Christmas trees, frozen in time at 50 meters, still holding its cargo as if the delivery might yet be made. These are not supernatural stories. There is no need to invoke anything beyond geology, physics, archaeology, and history to explain what is down there. But that is precisely what makes it so uncomfortable. We have sonar, we have submersibles, we have radiocarbon dating and satellite imagery and computational models that can reconstruct ancient shorelines to within a few meters. And still, Lake Michigan keeps its secrets. The circular depressions remain unexplained. The submerged forest raises questions about landscapes and peoples we may never fully recover. The Grand Traverse Bay stones sit in a frustrating limbo between natural formation and human construction. Le Griffon is still missing. Flight 2501 is still missing. The nickel-rich particle has not been conclusively confirmed, and the Christmas trees of the Rouse Simmons are slowly decaying, the clock finally catching up after more than a century of suspension. Every lake is a body of water. Lake Michigan is a body of evidence, and the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to believe that we have found everything it is hiding.